A war does not have to begin with a missile to hit your wallet, your gas pump, and the global economy all at once. Sometimes it begins with a threat aimed at a narrow strip of water most Americans will never see in person, but one that carries an extraordinary share of the world's energy. This week, that threat got louder. Iran's Revolutionary Guard signaled that if pressure on Tehran continues, energy exports from the region may not flow for anyone. And when Donald Trump answered, he did not just fire back with rhetoric. He hinted that Washington was ready to turn one of the world's most important sea lanes into a military line in the sand. What happens next could decide whether this stays a crisis of words or becomes a shockwave that reaches every major economy on Earth. If you want to understand why this moment matters, forget the headlines for a second and focus on one brutal reality. The modern world runs on choke points. It runs on a handful of narrow corridors where an enormous amount of oil, gas, and cargo has to pass every single day. And few matter more than the Strait of Hormuz. According to the Congressional Research Service, roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products moves through that passage. About 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade goes through it too. That means when Iran threatens Hormuz, it is not just threatening tankers. It is threatening the central nervous system of the global energy market. That is why even a few sentences from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps can move markets before a fleet even sails. Public reporting this month says the IRGC signaled that energy exports from the region would be either available to everyone or to no one. That wording matters. It is not a simple threat to American interests. It is a message aimed at every country that depends on Gulf energy, every ship owner calculating risk, every insurance underwriter raising premiums, and every government hoping this conflict stays contained. Tehran understands something many viewers instinctively understand too. If you cannot match the United States ship for ship and aircraft for aircraft, you go after the map. You go after geography. You turn sea lanes into leverage. And that is exactly what makes this so dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is a pressure point with almost no real substitute. Yes, there are bypass options. Saudi Arabia can push more crude through its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates can maximize throughput on its Abu Dhabi pipeline to the Gulf of Oman. But the Congressional Research Service says those alternatives together may offer only about 6 million barrels per day of available capacity. Compare that with the roughly 20 million barrels per day that normally transit Hormuz, and the problem becomes obvious. The backup plan is not really a backup plan. It is a partial workaround in a crisis that could overwhelm the entire system. That is one reason markets reacted so violently when this crisis escalated earlier in the year. The CRS report says Brent crude jumped 8% in just 2 days, rising from $71, $32 a barrel on February 27 to $77, $24 on March 7, and later broke above the $100 mark. That is not normal volatility. That is the market pricing in fear. And fear, in energy, spreads faster than facts. The moment traders believe a choke point is genuinely at risk, prices start moving long before the full physical disruption arrives. That is how a regional military confrontation becomes a global economic event. Now add the military timeline, and the picture gets even darker. The same CRS report says U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran since February were followed by Iranian military action across the Persian Gulf. Starting on March 4th, Iranian forces declared the strait closed and threatened, then carried out attacks on ships attempting to transit. By March 8th, 10 attacks on ships had been reported, with 5 deaths. Think about what that means. This is not a theoretical map room crisis anymore. Commercial crews, civilian vessels, and global supply chains are already inside the blast radius. And this is where Trump's response changed the story. According to The Hill, after recent Iranian attacks on commercial shipping, Trump threatened another big attack on Iran and warned the U.S. Navy could put back a blockade that would apply only to Iran. That is an important distinction. He was not describing a classic closure of the strait to everybody. He was signaling a selective strangulation strategy, one that keeps international traffic moving while squeezing Tehran specifically. In plain English, that means Washington wants to show it can defend the lane for the world while weaponizing access against Iran itself. That is not just retaliation. That is a statement about control. And Trump did not stop there. The same report says U.S. forces had already struck more than 80 targets in Iran, including air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 IRGC small boats in and near the strait. If that reporting is accurate, then this is no longer just a contest of threats. It is a live effort to degrade Iran's ability to contest the waterway. In other words, Washington is not merely warning Tehran against closing Hormuz. It is actively shaping the battlefield to make such a closure harder to sustain. But if that sounds reassuring, it should not. Because choke point warfare does not require perfect control. It only requires enough uncertainty to raise costs, delay shipments, scare insurers, and convince commercial operators that the route is no longer worth the risk. The CRS report says war risk insurance premiums rose to 4 or 5 times previous levels. That alone tells you how the private sector sees this environment. Companies do not wait for governments to declare a full-scale emergency. They price one in early, then pass the cost down the chain. Eventually, that shows up in fuel, freight, food, and consumer prices. The battlefield may be thousands of miles away, but the economic consequences do not stay there. And here is the piece many people miss. Hormuz is not just an oil story. According to CRS, the strait also matters for about 30% of global helium production and more than a third of global urea fertilizer supplies. That means the stakes go beyond gasoline and heating bills. Helium is critical in a range of industrial and medical applications. Fertilizer matters to agriculture, crop yields, and food prices. So when this corridor is threatened, the risk multiplies across sectors Americans do not usually connect to a Gulf maritime crisis. That is how modern supply chain pressure works. One bottleneck creates aftershocks in places that seem completely unrelated until prices start climbing. Now step back and look at Iran's logic. From Tehran's point of view, this is not irrational brinkmanship. It is coercive strategy. Iran knows it cannot outbuild the United States or outspend the Gulf monarchies, but it can make the cost of pressure uncomfortably high for everyone involved. It can create a dilemma for Washington's partners. Support the U.S. campaign, and your trade routes become less secure. Pull back, and maybe the tension eases. The message is not subtle. Iran wants outside powers, energy importers, and neighboring states to feel that they have skin in this confrontation, whether they like it or not. That is also why the possibility of a second choke point matters so much. Reuters reporting this month said Iran asked Yemen's Houthi movement to stand ready to close the Bab el-Mandeb gateway if the United States struck Iranian power infrastructure. That is a separate waterway linking the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and it is another artery for global commerce. If Hormuz is pressure point number 1, Bab el-Mandeb is pressure point number 2. Put both under threat at the same time, and the map starts to look less like a regional conflict and more like a coordinated campaign to stretch global shipping from the Gulf to the Red Sea. That is where the nightmare scenario begins. Reuters also reported that a Houthi Red Sea blockade could lift oil prices significantly, with one consultant cited saying disruption could push prices above roughly $115 to $120 a barrel, even with workarounds. That does not mean a catastrophic spike is guaranteed. It does mean the market already sees dual choke point risk as something more serious than background noise. And when you layer Bab el-Mandeb stress on top of Hormuz stress, shipping routes get longer, freight costs climb, delivery times stretch, and global inventories come under greater pressure. In a world that still depends on maritime energy flows, distance becomes a weapon. So what exactly is Trump trying to do? On one level, he is projecting deterrence. He wants Tehran to believe any further disruption will trigger punishing U.S. action. On another level, he is speaking to markets. He wants traders, insurers, Gulf producers, and American voters to hear one clear message: the United States can still keep the artery open. That matters politically because oil shocks do not stay in foreign policy briefings. They hit gas stations. They hit inflation. They hit public confidence. No White House wants to look passive while a major energy corridor spirals into chaos. But there is a risk buried inside that strategy. Selective blockades, punitive strikes, and public threats can restore deterrence if the other side blinks. If the other side does not blink, they can also create a ladder of escalation that becomes harder to climb down. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy outright. It only needs to keep proving that disruption remains possible. A few successful attacks, a few more vessels turned away, a few more insurance spikes, and suddenly the perception of control starts to crack. That is why this story is not really about who makes the tougher statement. It is about who can impose sustainable costs without triggering a regional economic panic. And that brings us to the most important distinction of all: confirmed fact versus analysis. The confirmed facts, based on the sources we have, are already serious enough. Iranian forces declared the strait closed earlier in the crisis. Attacks on shipping followed. Brent surged. U.S. forces struck Iranian military targets. Trump threatened more action and floated the return of an Iran-focused blockade. Those are concrete developments. The analysis comes in what follows. Will Iran really try to shut the lane on a larger scale? Will the Houthis expand the crisis into Bab el-Mandeb? Will Washington escalate from punitive strikes to a broader maritime enforcement campaign? Those answers are not settled. But the fact that all three questions are now credible is exactly why the world is paying attention. There is also a historical lesson here. For years, analysts talked about Hormuz as the place everybody feared, but nobody wanted to fully test. The assumption was that the cost of prolonged disruption would be so high that all sides would eventually pull back. That assumption may still prove true, but the 2026 crisis has already shown how much damage can be done before anyone reaches total closure. The market shock does not require a permanent shutdown. It only requires enough attacks, enough uncertainty, and enough proof that the old red lines are no longer stable. For American viewers, this matters for another reason. The United States may be a major energy producer, but it is not isolated from global pricing. Oil is a world market. Shipping risk in the Gulf can still feed directly into American inflation and consumer anxiety. And if the conflict widens, Washington faces a familiar but painful dilemma. Use more force and risk deeper entanglement. Use less force and risk looking unable to secure a vital artery of global trade. Neither option is politically clean. Neither option is strategically cost-free. There is one more angle worth watching, and it sits far from the missile batteries and patrol boats. Trump, according to reporting this month, has also treated the strait not only as a security problem, but as leverage. That suggests the administration sees maritime protection, regional burden sharing, and economic bargaining as parts of the same package. If that is true, then the crisis is not just a naval confrontation. It is also a test of whether the United States can convert military presence into broader political and financial advantage with Gulf partners while containing Iran at the same time. That is a very ambitious play. It could strengthen deterrence if it works. It could also make the standoff even more complicated if every side starts treating the waterway as a bargaining chip. So what should viewers actually watch now? First, watch shipping behavior, not just speeches. If commercial operators keep rerouting, delaying, or demanding higher premiums, that tells you the private sector still sees real danger. Second, watch whether attacks remain limited and episodic or become more systematic. There is a major difference between sporadic harassment and a sustained campaign to make transit functionally impossible. Third, watch Bab el-Mandeb. If Red Sea pressure rises at the same time Hormuz stays hot, the crisis enters a different category. And finally, watch energy prices with discipline. The market often signals deteriorating confidence before governments admit how fragile the situation has become. Because in the end, this story is bigger than Trump, bigger than the IRGC, and even bigger than one narrow strip of water. It is about how fragile the global system really is when one regional war starts probing the seams of trade, energy, insurance, and deterrence all at once. It is about how a few attacks on commercial shipping can force presidents, admirals, traders, and entire governments into the same emergency equation. And it is about a hard truth that keeps returning in geopolitics. The powers that dominate the map are never fully secure from the powers that know how to exploit it. That is why this moment feels so loaded. Iran's threat was not merely a warning. It was a reminder that geography can still punch far above military weight. Trump's answer was not merely bravado. It was a declaration that the United States intends to decide who moves through the world's most important energy corridor and under what conditions. If neither side backs down, the next phase of this crisis may not be defined by a single dramatic strike. It may be defined by a grinding contest over fear, access, price, and endurance. And those contests have a way of reaching much farther than the battlefield where they begin. So when people ask whether this is just another Middle East flare-up, the honest answer is no. Not when nearly 27% of maritime crude and petroleum trade sits inside the danger zone. Not when 20% of global LNG trade depends on the same corridor. Not when even the alternative pipelines can cover only a fraction of the normal flow. and not when the possibility of pressure on Bab el-Mandeb threatens to turn one choke point crisis into two. This is the kind of confrontation that can stay regional militarily while becoming global economically. And that is precisely what makes the next move so important. Because the next move will tell us whether this remains a coercive standoff or becomes the opening chapter of a much larger energy war. If you want clear, serious breakdowns of the military strategy, geopolitics, and global consequences behind stories like this, subscribe now and stay with the channel, because the next development in this crisis may show up first in shipping lanes, oil prices, and regional deployments long before the world realizes how much has changed.